we believe that Jesus is God, I think we are in danger of making one of the most powerful and central points of our faith into a serious mess, and that's the cross. We're messing with a very important death of Jesus when we say that he's God. And this is a good question that you can ask people in your conversations. Who died? Who died on the cross? Was it the Son of God? The New Testament says that it was the Son who died, so that's the person of the Son. But if Trinitarianism is right, and the one person of the Son is the divine person, the second person of the Trinity, right, who is immortal, then what even happened? Did no person really die on the cross? Did an abstract human nature die on the cross? Can such a thing like that even die or pay for sins? I mean, these are very serious questions, Sean, which most people have just blown off their whole life. And this is only one problem that we run into whenever we start saying that Jesus is God. Now, of course, you and I, as biblical Unitarians, we have absolutely no rational problem with the death of the Son on the cross, right? Or how that was possible. To this is a very straightforward, terrible, and awe-inspiring thing, but we have no rational problem with it. When we look at this, we see Jesus Christ, a human being, truly suffered and died the death of a criminal. He's in the ground, and then God, who is someone else, raises this dead man from the dead. This one event really has characterized the Christian faith. I mean, it's one of the Christianity's biggest distinctives from the other Abrahamic religions, right? Because in Islam, Jesus didn't die. In modern Judaism, they believe the Messiah won't die or suffer. But for Christians, this is the turnkey of the faith, the gospel about the kingdom, which you've done great work on, our own destiny in resurrection ourselves. None of that happens if Jesus didn't really suffer and die. I mean, I read in 1 Thessalonians where Paul says that if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, then God will raise us from the dead. So our hope of resurrection in the life of the age to come, we can't even have that if Jesus didn't die. And elsewhere, I believe that's in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, if Christ was not risen, then your faith is in vain. So if Christ didn't really die, and therefore wasn't really raised from the dead, then your faith is nothing. That's a pretty big deal. It's very, very important. And you made a point earlier that God is immortal. 1 Timothy, is that, I think that's 6:16.
Yep.
It says that God is immortal. Now, what does it mean to be immortal? Well, Trinitarians and others, they really live and die on their definition of death. They think that if they can redefine what death is, then they can get out of this problem. So they're going to define death as the separation of the soul from the body, right? That's all that is.
Right.
And they'll say that that's what happened on the cross. But in line with our earlier conversation, they obviously have a very Platonic pagan view of death, which is not really a death. It's just the crumbling away of a human nature that's attached to an immortal soul. But the bottom line is, to your point earlier, it doesn't really matter how they define death or try to redefine death, because you can't redefine the word immortal. Right. Immortal just means that whatever death is, you can't do it. So the Trinitarians have a big problem when they say Jesus is God, God can't die, and Jesus died. And so many people will just throw up their hands and call it a mystery. That's what I did for most of my life. But what's interesting, the historical Christians didn't do that. They wanted to try to figure it out. And the first people who were trying to figure that out were actually the Gnostics. In the early centuries, the Gnostics are trying to rationalize the deity of Christ with things like the crucifixion or his suffering or things like that. So some, they said Jesus didn't die at all. Some said the human Jesus and the divine Christ were actually two different people. Some said it was all a trick, and some other guy died in Jesus' place. And that's actually where I believe that Islam gets that. That's actually adapted, I think, from a Gnostic text called the Second Treatise of the Great Seth. But anyway, all this speculation is coming from trying to figure out how to get around the implications of saying that Jesus is God and God died. And the solutions that they came up with in church history through the councils weren't really very good solutions. I'm talking about the disputes between Nestorius and Cyril, and all of that is really a rehashing, a repackaging of different Gnostic Christologies that deity of Christ theology just continues to suck you back into. So what's really interesting is that so many Christians today, when they're asked about this very basic, very fundamental point of the faith that Jesus died, and you ask them what happened on the cross, they'll say something like, well, it was only the human nature that died on the cross.
Right.
The person, the God person, didn't actually suffer on the cross. Well, there's a few problems with that. First of all, the New Testament doesn't teach that. It doesn't teach it was a nature that died. The New Testament says that it was the Son that died. That's Romans 5:10, 8:32, well, even John 3:16, right? It's the Son. That's who's given. It's the person of the Son that dies. So that's one problem. Another problem is actually that answer is not really even in line with historical orthodoxy. Oftentimes, you'll find what modern Trinitarians are trying to teach you is actually the so-called heresy of Nestorianism that was defeated in the councils, which in turn is actually an old Gnostic Christology repackaged. Nestorius wasn't really teaching two persons, but Cyril said he did, and that's all that matters, right?
Well, yeah, I have my own take on Nestorius. I think he was just a victim of an
Yes.
incredible injustice.
That's right. Yeah, Cyril was essentially a gangster. But
yeah.
So, the reaction that Christianity is having against this so-called Nestorianism is really a reaction, I believe, to a latent Gnosticism that the deity of Christ believers just couldn't ever get away from. So, when an evangelical, is calling you a heretic for what you're saying, Sean, and then they say something like, well, only the human nature died, you can shake their hand and welcome them to the heretic club, I guess. The truth is that Cyril and that Orthodox party were actually working against the idea that just the Son's nature suffered. But Cyril's Orthodox solution, I'll put solution in some big air quotes there, wasn't really a solution. They ultimately said that the Son suffered impassibly. In other words, he suffered without suffering. So God died without dying. Even today, amongst Trinitarian scholars, there is this hesitation over what really happened on the cross. There's all this qualification going with what should be a very simple point. I remember, for example, reading Wayne Grudem, and he said this. He said, Jesus somehow tasted something of what it was like to go through death. Wow, so it was a taste. It
Sounds pretty vague to me.
Yeah, it was just, something of what it was like. Well, what that tells me is that it didn't really happen. And that's a big problem for me. It's a very dangerous thing, Sean, when we decide to turn the death of Jesus into sort of a question mark. I mean, after all, the New Testament says that this is the cornerstone for Christian belief, right? We were just talking about that. Paul says, your faith is in vain if you don't get this right, if you don't consciously believe that. And as a quick side note, I actually think that the various Gnostic groups had actually proven to be the more reasonable party than the Trinitarians on this point. So some of those Gnostic Christologies were saying that, well, there was the human Jesus in the Savior, and then there was another person who was the divine person. So they knew that if they're going to say that the Savior is God, then they had to confine that destruction of the cross to another person. They had to, kind of turn it into some kind of illusion. But on the other hand, evangelicals, I think they often try to have their cake and eat it too, to say, that the immortal God could die, that he did die. And, exactly what that means, well, that's just kind of up in the air. It's a question mark. So the important thing to take away from all of this is that Chalcedon didn't really settle the matter. Right? Chalcedon releases a statement which says there's two natures in Jesus, but they don't tell you what that means. It just means, they say they're without confusion, change, or division. Okay, so the natures aren't confused together, but they're also not separated either. The Orthodox philosophers will say, well, the death of the Son, the death of God is a mystery. So here we come, full circle, right? They didn't want to say that it's a mystery up front. They wanted to get in there and figure it out, but in the end, they really couldn't. And I think the Trinitarian establishment wants us to think that they have this great complex system that everybody agrees with, this big system that really works somehow on the inside. And, Sean, if you were a scholar, then you'd really get it. But you're just a poor person, and, this doesn't make sense to you because you're just not educated. Right. What I find is we've had thousands of years of cogitation over this, of very educated people, Catholics, willing to give their life for this. And at the very end, they still can't agree on exactly what it all means or how it works and how it makes sense. So, there may be some reasoning which seems sound on a very superficial level, but really in the end, it's actually full of problems when you dig into it. And I think the cross of Jesus is just one of the things that stands in the way. And it's a huge stumbling block for people. This is one of the big dangers of going down this road. But that's just not a problem for us as biblical Unitarians. And I take a lot of pride and comfort in that.